Dark Souls as a series is a notoriously challenging and unforgiving experience, especially for beginners. But the games don't throw you directly into the fray at the start, and instead ramp up difficulty until the game is the challenging beast it's best known for being. This led me to begin thinking about how the games teach players not just the controls, but how the world works as well, in order to prepare them for the remainder of the game. While Dark Souls is chock full of learning moments so that by the end of the game a regular player feels like an expert, there is no single section designed to teach players better than the tutorial. This led me to wonder about each Dark Souls game and how each tutorial leads players to better understand their respective game and what's ahead. However, once I began researching, I realized that there was quite a bit too much for me to fit into a single video. So instead, I'll be splitting the analyses into 3 parts, one for each mainline Dark Souls game. If you'd rather wait until all 3 analyses are finished, I'll compile a supercut of the whole series in a few weeks after the 3rd video is complete. But for this week, we're examining the tutorial of Dark Souls 1, the Undead Asylum. The Undead Asylum is by far my favorite of the 3 tutorials, due largely in part to how it teaches players. At this point, everyone realizes that holding the player's hand isn't the way to go, and the Asylum is a perfect example of teaching players how to play the game not through tooltips or pop-ups, but by experiencing the world for themselves in a non-overwhelming way. Yes, there are tooltips to learn the controls, but even these are presented in a fairly clever way, which we'll discuss later. While not all players will have the same experience in the Undead Asylum, the vast majority of players will follow a very similar path, in which certain scenarios are almost guaranteed to occur, allowing the player to learn. But I'm getting ahead of myself. First, let's quickly list out the order of events that occur in the Undead Asylum, so that we can keep the full picture in mind during the analysis. You first start out in a small room. After opening a locked door using this key, you travel down a short hallway filled with weak, non-aggressive enemies. After a short trip up a ladder, you emerge into the main lobby of the asylum and walk past a bonfire to reach the boss room. You can't kill the asylum demon conventionally, so you have to escape through a small door to your left. Through this door there is another bonfire, and further on is a long hallway with an archer at the end. In this hallway you can retrieve your starting equipment and then kill the archer. Afterwards, you pass through a fog door and you come to the first branch in your path. To the left, you find a dead end with an item just out of reach, and to your right, you will find a set of stairs. Following them down leads back to the main lobby bonfire through a door which was previously locked. Traveling up the stairs leads to being crushed and damaged by a rolling boulder with an undead at the top of the stairs. Behind this enemy is a locked door. Since you have no key, you are forced to turn back and explore for it, which reveals a wall which was broken by the boulder. Inside, there is an NPC who will provide you with both the key and your Estus flask. Using this key, you can pass through the locked door leading to an outer balcony, where you'll fight 2 melee undead and an archer. After they're dealt with, you can either pass through the fog wall or explore a side room with an undead soldier and a locked door. Passing through the fog wall will have you positioned on a small ledge above the asylum demon, allowing you to use a plunging attack, giving you advantage in the fight. With your new weapon, it is possible to kill him, allowing you to open the door to the rear of the room, which leads to a very obvious path up a hill. However, exploring off the beaten path reveals a hidden item. After that, all that's left is to climb the hill in order to proceed with the rest of the game. Phew. There's a lot to unpack there. While it's a short and relatively easy segment of the game, almost every single section is engineered to teach players not just the controls, but the rules of the game world. So let's unpack it from the start again, this time analyzing why each segment is engineered to assist the new player experience. Before we start, however, I want to briefly address how the game teaches controls. I don't actually care about the tooltips themselves at all, but this concept will be important when we later discuss Dark Souls 2 and the things betwixt. In this game, they teach players through glowing messages left on the ground, exactly like player messages which are left later in the game. This makes new players immediately associate the glowing marks left on the floor with possible assistance. It's pretty simple, but effective nonetheless, teaching new players that the marks can have helpful knowledge. Even a player who immediately understands the controls and doesn't necessarily need the help will still develop this association. This dual purpose is used in many aspects of the area and ensures that even if a lesson is not applicable to a certain player, everyone is guaranteed to learn something. It's brilliant, really, and is such a far departure from how many games treat the tutorial, even with regard to simply learning the controls. However, let's begin exploring the asylum proper, beginning first with the starting room. Here, the visuals of items are introduced to the player as a key is needed to open the door. It's simple, but introducing players to how items look early on is important. This also gives an association between silver, glowy objects and valuable treasure. This association is later used with the appearance of crystal lizards, as it is immediately apparent to new players that these monsters are valuable, as they share a similar appearance to item drops. Next, we have the short hallway. This hallway contains very few lessons about how the game is designed, acting more as a conventional tutorial area, teaching players the controls, how to attack and lock on against enemies who won't fight back. Next up is the main lobby. Like most parts of the asylum, this area is very simple, but laid out in a very clever way. As players emerge from the ladder room, the main door to the boss room is immediately visible, and most players will run toward it in order to progress, as it's very obviously the main feature of this room. In doing so, they will run directly next to the bonfire as it's positioned perfectly in between the exit of the ladder room and the entrance to the boss room. Since they'll walk right past it, a prompt will appear at the bottom of the screen to first light and subsequently rest at the fire, which will teach players about respawning should they die to the boss. Speaking of which, let's get to the boss room, since this is when things get really interesting. The Asylum Demon is famous, due in part to both being a formidable boss and the first real enemy of the Dark Souls series. This decision is honestly genius for a variety of reasons. First off, putting a boss as the first enemy creates an association for new players. The bosses are the main hurdles that must be overcome, and that they are going to be a consistent challenge, so much so that initially players can't even damage the demon. This also makes him loom larger in the player's mind, as the very first enemy they meet is a towering mass of flesh that's 5 times larger than the player, which they can't even scratch, and who kills them in only a few hits. Since this boss is so initially intimidating, this leads to a second interesting lesson: retreat. It isn't possible. Once players realize that the damage they deal is negligible, many will try to run past him out the big pilgrim's door, but find it locked, teaching them that once a boss area is entered, the boss must be killed to progress. Other players might try to run back out the way they came, but that door will also be blocked, teaching them that once a player commits to entering a boss area, retreat isn't an option at all. This leaves the players 2 choices. Attempt to kill the boss doing 2 damage at a time, which is borderline impossible. Yes, I realize that the boss can be killed with black firebombs pretty easily, but that requires a specific gift, and most new players won't even consider doing that, so I'm not going to count it as a realistic option. The more realistic alternative is that they escape through the small passageway on the left. This teaches a final lesson, that sometimes you aren't prepared to face an obstacle, and it's best to leave and come back another time. Dark Souls is a challenging and arguably difficult game, sure, but it should never feel impossible. This is a really valuable lesson and prepares new players for the fairly open world that awaits them after the tutorial, as both New Londo and the Tomb of Giants are immediately accessible from the Firelink Shrine, but both are endgame areas that a new player would most likely find extremely difficult or impossible. While we still have a lot to cover, I want to note just how fantastic the Asylum Demon fight is. In a single short boss fight, every new player will learn anywhere between 2 and 4 extremely vital and applicable lessons, which subconsciously prepare them for the rest of the game without shoving the lessons down their throat. With all that in mind, it's no wonder that the Asylum Demon is so well known and memorable, despite being a comparatively easy tutorial boss. But enough about that. Let's continue on, as there's still a surprising amount left to learn from this area. Immediately after leaving the boss room, a gate slams shut, providing a very clear visual representation that certain enemies won't follow you if you exit their area. This concept is accented by the Asylum Demon being seen pacing back and forth if you look back through the gate. Afterwards, there is a small room with a bonfire, and if the player took any damage during the fight, they'll learn another important mechanic, which is that bonfires heal you to full health. While all of these bonfire mechanics are admittedly pretty simple, and would inevitably be realized after playing for a short amount of time, introducing players to these concepts one by one in an intentional manner allows them to sink in and cement in the player's mind. It also gives players an association between bonfires and safety, as the bonfire acts as a pleasant haven directly following the boss fight. After the bonfire room is a long hallway containing an archer at its end, and while this area is seemingly quite simple, there are a few clever tricks in the layout of this hall. At the beginning of the hall, players can retrieve their shield, which is in the entrance to a small room where they'll be safe from the archer. This allows players to fiddle with menus and equip their shield in safety. If players attempt to equip their shield without ducking into the alcove first, they're likely to take damage, teaching that time won't stop whenever they're in menus. The long hallway ensures that once players leave the haven, the archer will get off a few shots before the player reaches him, which ensures that the players will either have to use their shield or learn the basic timings to dodge an arrow when an enemy can't immediately be dealt with. This concept is later used quite frequently, but a particularly well-known example would be the Archer Knight in Anor Londo. Once players reach the archer, however, he will retreat up a flight of stairs and out of sight, allowing players to retrieve their main weapon. This is significant for several reasons. First, since this is the first non-boss enemy the players faced, having the archer first attack, then retreat from the player before attacking again gives a semblance of intelligence, and lets players know that not all enemies are mindlessly aggressive. And this is a good thing because for the rest of the tutorials, enemies will be mindlessly aggressive. Since the first enemy players face is intelligent, this concept is set to default rather than the default being that all enemies are mindless zombies. Second, players who are over-aggressive and chase after the archer to kill him before equipping their weapon will find that they once again only deal a minuscule amount of damage. This discourages recklessly aggressive behavior in players as there's no safe area in the stairwell, meaning that over-aggressive players will have to make a walk of shame back outside, where a final lesson is taught through the positioning of the archer in the stairwell. Due to his position, there is a safe area on either side of the entrance, where the players will once again have an area to fiddle with menus safe from the archer. Once the proper weapon is equipped, the archer will die in 1 or 2 hits, allowing the player to finally progress into their first fog wall. The placement of this wall is somewhat questionable, since a much more obvious place for our first fog wall would have certainly been before the first boss fight. However, while it would have been more obvious, it wouldn't necessarily be better or send the right message. While fog walls are largely associated with boss fights, not all fog walls necessarily precede a fight. Since a second fog wall precedes the final fight with the Asylum Demon, placing one here allows players to experience both uses in the tutorial. There is also an argument to be made that the initial fight isn't actually a boss fight, as the boss is nearly invincible, and the developers didn't really want to send the wrong message. Either way, after the fog wall, the player returns to the upper level of the main lobby. This lends to the idea of an interconnected world, in which doubling back on yourself to reach a new area is common. And this is mirrored in just the general world design of Dark Souls. It is here that the player faces their first decision, as they reach a branching path. To the left is a dead end with an enemy on a ledge just out of reach. This incentivizes players to move forward and is later stuck behind a locked door, showing that backtracking is an important part of the world while simultaneously encouraging players to return later. Going back to the right leads to a staircase where the player once again has 2 options. Going down acts as a shortcut back to the main lobby bonfire through a door which was locked from the other side. While the Asylum is largely linear, this simple door teaches players the entire concept of creating shortcuts back to bonfires and the interconnectivity of most areas in the game. This example is particularly helpful in this game, as Dark Souls 1 is easily the most interconnected game in this series, as fast traveling isn't really possible until over halfway through the game. Conversely, Dark Souls 2 and 3 have fast traveling available immediately, so perhaps it's no surprise that they have no shortcut in the tutorial, but let's hold off on that for now, because the boulder trap in the next section is easily my favorite part of the entire area. As players go up the stairs, they will most likely be hit by this giant boulder and knocked back downwards. It's a frustrating surprise for sure, but the boulder only does a small amount of damage and is a far cry from the one-hit kill traps present later in the game, namely in Sen's Fortress. Once the player runs up the stairs, it's fairly obvious that the undead at the top is responsible for pushing the boulder. This teaches players that some traps are triggered by killable enemies, which is once again relevant in several other later areas, where an enemy can be killed in order to stop a trap from occurring. While the undead dies easily enough, its simple presence is enough to teach the player. However, after killing the undead, the player is at a bit of an impasse, as the door behind him cannot be opened. The player will first assume that they missed something and begin to backtrack to look for a key, only to find this wall destroyed and an NPC within. This leads to another lesson which is reused several times: destructible environments, which are later used in Sen Fortress yet again when the wall has to be destroyed in order to reach an NPC. Once a player enters this room, they receive the Estus Flask and a key which allows them to progress. The flask is automatically equipped. This is important. Since most players took damage from the boulder trap, they are immediately able to heal that damage fully using the flask, teaching them both the value of the flask charges and consequently the value of healing. It's really fascinating how a trap as simple as a boulder rolling down some stairs can be used to impart so much valuable knowledge about the game to someone who's never even played it. Moving on, however, we reach the outside balcony. This is the first chance for players to fight multiple enemies at once, with a mix of ranged and melee enemies. Since the melee enemies jump out at the player, it is natural for them to fall back into this open area behind them, which just happens to be out of the archer's sightlines. This divide and conquer technique that players naturally fall into due to enemy positioning once again becomes invaluable in later areas of the game when it's not viable to face multiple enemies at once. Once the 3 undead are dealt with, there are only 2 rooms left. The first is a side room, which contains an undead soldier guarding a locked door. While this room is ultimately pointless, it hammers home that players will be unable to retrieve the item they saw on that ledge until they return. This is also the first appearance of a shielded enemy, and while he wields a sword similar to the undead we've seen so far, he has a much more varied repertoire of attacks and fights in a very different way, despite using the same weapon and being roughly the same size. This allows players to understand enemy diversity without being overwhelmed. And finally, we have the boss room, and the final fight of the tutorial. Players emerge from a ledge above the Asylum demon, giving them several seconds to attempt a plunging attack in order to deal an extremely satisfying amount of damage to the boss before the fight even begins. This emphasizes both the benefits that being well prepared gives, as well as how important height advantage can be. Players who understand these lessons will benefit in the very next boss fight against the Taurus demon. While it's perfectly viable to fight him conventionally, players who realize that they can get on top of the tower they emerge from and use that height to their advantage by luring the demon below them will have a much easier time in this fight. After the player finishes the fight with the Asylum demon, there's only one thing left to do: leave the Asylum. A message just outside the door will tell players to go straight ahead up a very obvious path, but exploring off this path will lead to players finding a hidden item. And the existence of this item imparts one last lesson upon players, that there are secrets everywhere, and whatever you're told to do is ultimately just a suggestion. Sure, you have to do certain things to beat the game, such as ringing the bells of awakening, but you can ring them in either order. You can visit the Tomb of Giants before the undead perish, and you can kill Sif before Quelaag. This small item teaches that ultimately Dark Souls is an open path, and exploring it fully is allowed and will be rewarded. So, that's it for the Undead Asylum. Before we finish, let's discuss whether or not it's really a good tutorial and if it successfully prepares players for the remainder of the game. In short, I would personally say yes. The Undead Asylum prepares new players for the rest of the game and thoroughly explains both the general game mechanics while teaching the controls. It also teaches very general concepts that are going to be important for the remainder of the game by letting players experience those concepts for themselves. These concepts are taught in an intentional manner, one by one, as to not overwhelm a novice player. Dark Souls is a challenging and punishing game, and while the Asylum isn't exactly difficult, it really imparts that mistakes will be punished. Whether it's through the high damage that the Asylum demon deals, the frustration caused by the boulder traps, and the fact that mindlessly rushing after an enemy results in that enemy being considerably more difficult. While the tutorial manipulates players into following a likely sequence of events that will teach them, it does so without holding the player's hand and leading them along. While it might not be the most exciting or fun of the 3 Dark Souls tutorials, it is by far the most effective. That's my view, but what do you think? Does the Undead Asylum succeed in teaching new players? What would you change in order to make it more effective or convey concepts more clearly? Let me know in the comments below, because I'm really excited to hear your thoughts, as this entire series is proving very interesting to me. Next time, I'll be covering Dark Souls 2 and the things betwixt. If you'd like to be notified when I release that video, or just want to help support me in this channel, please consider subscribing. This series has taken around 65 hours of researching, writing, and editing, so I'd really appreciate the support. Either way, thank you so much for watching. I realize that this video is a bit long, but there was a lot to cover and discuss. Thank you for your continued support, and I'll see you in the next one.